It's Creepy here. I'm here again. I've been gone for a little bit, and my only excuse is I've been a lazy little shithead. Anyway, I'm recording at my grandparents' house in a really small room with a fridge in it, so it might be a bit loud, but it's away from everyone else so I don't disturb them. Now, bit of news. The text-to-speech that I normally use is no longer on the internet anymore, so that's not fun. So I now have a different one, so things might sound a bit different, but it took me forever, but I finally found one. Anyway, I'm uploading this for purely my own enjoyment and just feeling good about myself, and not really bothering about what other people think. But and besides, the big YouTubers are going to cover this. Full credit goes to the original writers over on Reddit, the subreddit Let's Not Meet. Okay, without further ado, let's begin.
Number 1, just to give a little background, there was a boy I met in high school with a reputation for being creepy that I didn't take seriously enough when we first met. I could talk for days about the hell he has put me through over the past 9 years, but I only wanted to recount the story of our most recent encounter. This happened a few months ago while I was still living in an apartment in the town my college is in. I have since moved back to my hometown to live with my parents while I finish up school, since I finally have a car and the commute is usually less than 30 minutes. Plus housing in the town where my college is so expensive. Final bit of background, although I know that this guy has a weird obsession with me, it had been nearly a year to the day since he had last tried to contact me, and more than that since I had run into him in person, so he wasn't exactly at the front of my mind. In high school I and my friends were always very careful with my home address, and I am thankful he doesn't know where I live now. Over the summer, I joined a slow-pitch co-ed rec softball team. I hadn't played since high school, and being back on the field was such a joy. I had invited a few of my coworkers to the game since we were a fairly tight-knit group. They were our only spectators that night, from the bleachers, as far as I could tell. I slipped my phone into my backpack so I could focus on the game. Afterwards, when I had gotten back into my car and was queuing up some music, I noticed a text from a number I didn't recognize saying I had hit well in the game that night. I thought it was from my coworker's girlfriend who had recently started working with us as well, and decided I would thank her when I got home. It is important for me to note the setup of my apartment building. We have a tenants-only lot that is nearer to the back door of the building, which is locked at all hours of the day, and is the entrance that I usually used because it let in right by the stairs. I lived at the first apartment to the right from the stairs on the second floor. The front entrance, however, had an outer door that was always unlocked and an inner door that was always locked. Next to the inner door was the buzzer, and our landlord listed the tenants' last names next to the buttons. This entryway and inner door is all glass, and you can look down into the entryway from the second floor. There are no security cameras at either entrance. I did not feel that I was being followed on my drive home, and I am usually very cautious and paranoid, thinking I am being followed when I am not. This night I was exhausted after a full day of work and a 9 p.m. softball game. I parked and entered my apartment as usual, locking the door behind me. I had barely been home for 10 minutes when the buzzer started making noise. My roommates weren't home and I wasn't expecting any guests. The buzzer is such a loud and unpleasant noise, and it used to put me on edge every time I would hear it. My roommate would often leave her keys at home and ring me to let her in, but she would always text first, and I had not heard from her. I decided to check the entryway to see if it was one of my roommates rather than hitting the button to let this mystery guest in, and I am so glad that I did. When I got down the hall, I thought I would faint. I would recognize this fucker anywhere. He saw me through the windows and began screaming at me to let him the fuck in. I bolted back to my apartment and locked the deadbolt and chain, plus our patio door for good measure, because although I lived on the second floor, it would not be difficult for someone of his height to climb up. I called the police and they were there within a few minutes, but he had already disappeared by that time. The cops took my statement and I showed them the message, because by the time I had deduced that it wasn't from my coworker, I blocked the number. They left someone stationed at my building that night in case he showed back up, but never did. I was too terrified to sleep, and the guy I was kind of seeing told me I had overreacted and he wouldn't come keep me company, nor would he let me stay over that night. I haven't heard from him since, but that doesn't mean that I won't. I know. It's been 9 years. He always finds me. I will be leaving the state when I graduate for a lot of reasons, but he is one of them. TLDR, I hadn't seen or heard from my stalker in over a year, and I unknowingly led him right to my apartment. Edit formatting edit 2 broke things off with the guy after that night because I had lost so much respect for him. He then became my boss and was the worst boss I've ever had because he truly just shows no sympathy for other people. A real rat. Number 2, when I am bored I sometimes hop onto Tinder to meet new and interesting people. I rarely attempt to meet these people in person, and when I do it is normally to meet up. Well, this was one of those nights. I met a really nice sounding woman who said she loved caffeine and video games. We were talking for a while that night, and when I was ready to get off and go to bed she asked if I wanted her number. I didn't want her to have my number, so I said, "No, that's okay, I know where to find you." I meant on Tinder. Flash forward to the next day when the new Assassin's Creed Origins game came out. I had pre-ordered the games months before and walked into literally the closest GameStop to my house, and guess who I see behind the counter? She had a sheer look of horror on her face, but I hadn't quite figured out it was her yet. There wasn't much of a line, and I got up to the register and she yells loud enough so everyone in the store could hear, "This is what you meant?" And she stormed off to the back room, and a couple minutes later another employee came out and asked me to leave. One thing I should point out is that in person this girl looked nothing like profile picture, so I still don't know what is going on. I explained to this new employee that I was here to pick up my pre-order and that I didn't understand why I needed to leave. They then threatened to call the cops if I didn't leave. I gave up and left. Later I got a message on Tinder asking how I knew where she worked. I did not respond to this message. Instead I called the GameStop, explained that I didn't want to upset Kathy any more than I had, and asked if they could move my pre-order to another store. The manager apologized to me and was able to move my pre-order. Even though this is the closest GameStop to my house, I haven't returned, and it will probably be a while before I do. Number 3, I had just moved into a new flat with some friends for university. At this point we didn't know the area well, and we're still getting our feet on the ground. We had a large chain supermarket a few blocks from us, and none of us had a car, so that's normally where we'd go for shopping, because it was in walking distance. The supermarket had a foyer with some benches, so normally whoever finished shopping first would wait for the others there. On this day, my flatmate Kate finished shopping before the rest of us, so she went to wait out the front. It was late evening and the store was winding up, so she was basically alone in the foyer. She'd buried herself in her phone when a man sat down next to her on the bench, much closer than was comfortable. Now we live in a small city in a small country where there isn't a lot of racial diversity, so it's worth mentioning this guy was black. She later told me it was the first time she'd ever met an African person. There really just aren't many of them in our country, let alone our city. He was wearing a completely black suit that didn't fit him, and he smelled overpoweringly of cologne and cigarettes. Kate told me he smelled like he hadn't washed in a while too. According to her, there was a fairly long pause after he sat down, and the conversation went something like this. Guy, hello. Kate, you, hi? Guy, you have beautiful hair. Kate, thanks. Guy, what is your name? Kate, Louise, yours? Guy, I am from Somalia. Briefer pause. Guy, where do you live? It was at this point I had finished and came out to meet her. I could immediately tell how tense and uncomfortable she was. As soon as she saw me, she jumped up. I can still remember his face. While he was talking to her, he had this kind of creepy fixed grin, all teeth, and roaming eyes that were all over her. As soon as he saw me, the smile was gone, replaced by a completely blank expression. He got off the bench almost before she did and turned and walked toward the store entrance, as if he was trying to pretend I couldn't see him that way. On the way home, she told me how creeped out she was, and how she'd probably take her motor scooter to a different store in the future. I thought she was overreacting, but she should do whatever makes her feel safest. She was only 18 and pretty sheltered. This kind of thing had never happened to her before. A few hours after we get home, I'm just about to go to bed. While I'm brushing my teeth, I hear someone knock at the door. We hadn't been living there long, and we'd literally never had someone come to the door like that, let alone near midnight. I was immediately on edge. As I opened the door just a crack, I put my full weight against the frame to stop it getting forced open. There on the doorstep was the guy from the supermarket. He had his creepy fixed smile on again. "Guy, can Louise come out?" At first I couldn't really understand his accent, but I worked him out after a few seconds. "Me, nobody with that name lives here." I didn't know Kate had been smart enough to give him a false name, but it didn't matter. When I said that, he dropped the smile, but didn't walk away. Instead, "Guy, can I have your phone?" Me, "No." "Guy, can I borrow your cigarettes?" Me, "No." "Goodbye." At this point I closed the door. I watched through our kitchen window as he wandered slowly down our driveway and onto the dark street. He didn't look back, but instead he pulled out his own cell phone and started making a call. He must have followed us home. There was no other way he could have known where we lived. The fact he knew I smoked at the time meant he'd watched me come out of the house at some point during the evening. I hadn't had a smoke on the walk home, and I'd cooked dinner as soon as I got back. I only went out for a smoke after I'd eaten, which was probably an hour and a half after we got back. Had he been out there somewhere in the bushes, watching that whole time? And if he had his own phone, why the hell did he need mine? I told Kate, and made sure to keep all our doors and windows locked. I was shaken up enough I didn't sleep much at all that night. But by the next day I'd calmed down and put it out of my mind. A few days later, in the early afternoon while I was biking to work, I saw him walking near our house. He was wearing the exact same clothes as before, on the phone and smoking a cigarette. Almost as soon as I got to work, I got a call from one of my other flatmates. The guy had knocked on the door again, once again asking for Louise. I told him the story quickly before I clocked in for my shift, and he promised to keep an eye on things during the evening. That was the last I heard of our odd visitor for months. Eventually I learned our neighbors over the road were refugees from Somalia, and one afternoon I introduced myself to them and started chatting about neighborly stuff. They were a house of 4 middle-aged single mothers, all with young kids and absent fathers who had either been killed in conflict or had been denied refugee status. Somalia really doesn't sound like a great place to live, put it that way. It turns out my town has a very small but close-knit community of Somalians, only about 150 people, almost all of them refugees. In case you don't know, their culture values sharing as a community value. If you need something, you can ask for it, and your neighbor will usually give it to you. Something like sharing a cell phone around the community is pretty normal. Obviously that doesn't work here, but that's where he had come from. The more I talked and learned, the more it kind of made sense why this guy was acting the way he did. He was a fish out of water. Didn't understand his behavior, was a bit creepy in his new home country, and was just trying to be friendly. I honestly started to feel really bad about judging him so harshly, even if he did make my friend uncomfortable. One of the times I was talking to the neighbor ladies, I asked if they knew who he was. At first they were confused and weren't sure who I was talking about, but as I started describing him, they went from my friendly, laughing neighbors to deadly serious. They started asking questions about him. When was he here? What did he want? Who was he on the phone with? Suddenly I was the one getting grilled. Eventually they started explaining what they knew. They knew of him, but didn't know him personally. According to them, they thought he had been involved in human trafficking back in Somalia. In fact, the exact word they used was slavery. They didn't explain much, but I understood from what they said that the trafficking generally involves young, beautiful girls, a lot like my flatmate Kate. They wouldn't tell me his name, and they didn't know what he did for a living now that he was here. They told me since he had been in our country he'd been in constant trouble with the police for following young women, even though he was apparently married to someone back in Somalia. They found that the most dishonorable thing about him, even though he'd also been arrested a few times for theft, they really didn't like him, because they felt people like him gave their community a bad name. A year or two went by after this, and by total chance I saw a short article in the newspaper. The headline was something like, "Refugee convicted of sexual assault." His name was suppressed, but the article revealed he was Somalian. A couple of months after I'd last seen him, he'd forced his way into another student flat by following some girls home from class. He waited a few hours until only one of them was at home, then barged through the door when she answered it, and assaulted her. He'd also stolen her cell phone and laptop afterwards. That kind of thing almost never happens in our city, and the similarities between what happened there and what happened to us made me certain it was the same guy. I never found out what happened to him after that, but I hope he's still in prison. I really don't think less of the local Somalian community because of him though. The ladies I was friends with were some of the nicest and friendliest people I've ever met. The hardships they've gone through aren't something anyone should have to experience, and for them to come out smiling and positive takes a strength I don't think I could ever possess. But the creepy tall skinny dude who followed me and my friend home that night? Yeah, let's not meet.
Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. That's all for me. See ya.